Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this how-to, we're going to cover the full process of working with SVGs, from our design tool all the way through to the code. So first off, let's talk about why you would want to use SVGs. So SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and vectors are basically just coordinate data that gets rendered by the browser directly. And what this means is you actually don't have any pixels. It's different from raster elements. And a huge advantage to this is they can be scaled, as indicated by the name Scalable Vector Graphics, up and down without losing any quality or sharpness. Another big advantage that we'll see is scalable vector graphics are actually composed of code, and this code can actually be pasted in directly inside of HTML and given class names. It can be formatted as needed, and we can give it special attributes and even enhance its accessibility with dedicated markup. In addition to providing more flexibility by putting SVG code directly in HTML, it also saves on server requests by not having to use an image tag and request an outside file to download. To start things off, let's begin with a simple icon example. And let's assume that this icon is something we just found laying around in a design file. Now we need to get it exported so we can use it in our code. So the first thing we want to do is take a look at this and see what the state of this icon is. So as we look at our files here, we can see that it's just two rectangles that have been arranged to form this chevron icon shape. And the first thing we want to do in working with SVGs is combine any shapes and flatten it down to the simplest possible paths to really clean up the files. We also at this stage want to get rid of any unnecessary grouping or layers. Sometimes you'll see hidden layers or groups wrapping around several elements. We want to basically clean up our files as much as possible so the generated code is much cleaner and lighter to work with. So to begin, let's just duplicate this first step here. And let's call this step 2. And what we can start with doing is actually creating a union shape. And let's make sure we retain our naming here. So this is the icon chevron, right? And let's get rid of this group that we won't need anymore. So with this union shape, if we pull out another step here, just to keep things nice and separated, it's always good to keep duplicating things as you work, especially with illustrations. That way you don't have to go back in history, or if you've closed your files, that way you can ensure you can always go back to the original asset that is as live as possible and retain the integrity of the original design. So back in step 3 here, we have this union shape, and you can see that Figma does a great job of keeping this still alive and separated so you can edit it as needed. But in the case of exporting for SVG, a lot of our file prep is best handled by flattening things as far as they'll go. So let's select our union layer here and go to flatten or Control or Command E and get this flattened. And now you'll see that's basically just a flat vector path, which is exactly what we want. Now we could export this icon directly as we see it here, but you'll notice its dimensions aren't whole pixel values. So here we have 19.8, the height is 33.94. This isn't really nice for sizing or for adding padding around it. It makes it a lot more difficult to work with this. So a really critical stage of exporting SVGs, especially for use with icons or when you have to retain specific layout, is to think about the view box or the bounding box around the icon itself. So let's duplicate this one more time. And we'll get our layers arranged and renamed. And for this icon, its height is already at 33.94. Let's assume this is going inside of an icon button, which has dimensions of 48 by 48. To make things nice and easy, let's just resize this artboard real quick to be 48 by 48. Get these centered up and make sure our group is resized appropriately, and fix our alignment here just to keep our design files nice and clean. And the last step here is that we just want to export the icon. And what we can see now that we have the bounding box or the view box in place is sometimes icons require some optical centering to look more balanced. So here you can see that this chevron icon, although it is technically centered, if we inspect it here, you can see it's about 14 pixels on either side. If we look at it visually, it looks like it's heavily weighted to the left. And so by addressing the bounding box early on, we can also ensure that it is well centered inside of whatever component we're going to use it in. And that way we don't have to do really tedious CSS to push it over a pixel or two. We can do that nudging ahead of time. So let's play around with this a little bit, nudging it. Okay, so that's definitely too far to the right. That's looking pretty good. I think that looks just about optically centered there. So now we know that visually it'll look great if we take this 48 by 48 and drop it into a button of the same size. Everything's already visually centered. Or even if this icon was inside of a much larger component, it'd be much easier to just simply vertically and horizontally center it without having to nudge it another pixel or two. So the final step to prep for this export here is we actually don't need this plate at all. We have it inside of a frame in Figma. And we don't want to export this background color anyway. So we can simply delete this plate layer. And I know this is hard to see in our design files right now, but this is the final step. So let's get it exported real quick. So on this frame in Figma, we have our export settings. And so we'll add an export setting for SVG. So let's go ahead and export this layer. I'm just going to put it on my desktop here. And now that we have it exported, we could drop it into our code editor right away, but I like to run all my SVGs through optimization first. Okay, so you can see here that I have a tool called SVGOMG, and this is a really popular tool for optimizing SVG code as needed. What's really nice is you can just paste markup if you already have the SVG open directly. In our case, we're going to open the SVG file from our desktop. So we're going to open this file up. You can't really see it here because the color is so faint, but it is appearing. And if we go to our markup tab, we can actually copy out this markup directly. So let's copy this. On our left here, we have some starter files that will be available in the video description. And the nice thing about working with SVG is it's just code at the end of the day. So we can paste this markup into our HTML directly. Let's get our code formatted a little bit here. And a couple things I like to do when working with SVGs is to remove any unnecessary attributes like fill values. So if this was a complex illustration and we know we always wanted the colors to remain the same, you could leave these fill attributes untouched. But in our case, since this is a common UI SVG, it'd be better to provide fill values and even to be able to adjust the sizing of this through CSS. So let's remove this fill none and this fill on the path itself. Let's also make sure that our SVGs have a view box. And because we created the desired bounding box in Figma for our SVG, we can match it to the width and height. These first two coordinates are 0, 0, and then we have our width and height. And this basically establishes a really straightforward and flexible coordinate system for SVG. So the last thing I'm going to do to this SVG code is let's just give it a class of, let's say, icon chevron and give that a save. If we look at our live preview here, we have a couple base styles that I applied in the starter files. So we have some of the colors that we use for this how-to. The body just has a very simple reset on it and is aligning items to the center of the viewport. And it has this dark reddish brown color. We'll use this screen meter only class in just a minute here. But beneath this, let's create a new section for our icons. And so we have our icon chevron, and we can say that it's fill. In this case, we want to be our lightest color that we have in our color book above. So this would be alarm 94. And if we give this a save, now we have this icon appearing here. If we were to inspect this, we would see that the SVG has that 48 by 48 view box on it, which would make it really easy to align with other elements. It's already optically centered within that view box. And the really cool thing about having the SVG present here, a huge advantage over a raster image like a JPEG or a PNG or a GIF, is that we can zoom the browser infinitely so, and it'll always look crisp because this is just coordinate data rendering in the browser directly. There's no actual pixels involved here. Another huge advantage of inlining this SVG instead of using it in an image tag by setting the source equal to it is that we have the code directly in our markup, and this actually saves us on a server request, so it's great for performance as well. A cool thing about having a class name applied to it directly is, let's say that this was inside of a button, we can also add styles for different interactions as well. So we could say that on hover, let's say just as an illustration of this, let's say the fill goes to blue. So if we give this a save, you can see that looks horrible, but it just demonstrates that basically if you use the SVGs directly and you include class names on it, instead of just leaving the hard-coded fills, you can have a lot of opportunities with CSS to update their styling for statefulness and interaction, as well as actually animating various paths within the SVG for more complex presentations or illustrations. All right, so that takes care of our icon example here. Let's scroll down a bit here and work with something a little more complicated. So again, in this scenario, let's imagine that we have this logo that is in our designs, and you see that we have this logo icon as well as the logo type on the right. And let's assume that in some situations you want to simply show just the icon, in others you want to show just the logo type, and in a third situation you'd want to show all three. Well, to make this most flexible, it'd be best to treat each of these sections of our logo as separate SVGs. And another advantage of using SVG for the logo type here on the right is, let's say this typeface is unique to just the logo, whereas everything else in our app uses a different typeface. Again, we can actually save on a server request by not needing a dedicated typeface just for this logo type. However, if this exact typeface appeared throughout our app, it would make sense to do this with actual text instead. So let's treat each of these left and right sections of our logo separately and talk about how to best handle these assets. If we look at our files here, we'll see it's a similar situation where we have this background plate that's not necessarily sized to how we want our SVG dimensions to be. If we look into our logo here, we have an icon and just some live text in our Figma file here. And in our icon, we actually have these two squares. The top one has a transparency. It's only 60% opaque on the white fill, and the square on the bottom is showing through to create this third color on the overlap. So Figma actually does a pretty good job of handling SVG exports by default. So you could actually export directly from this group and you'd end up with pretty clean code, but it's best to avoid things like transparencies in your UI and to think about opportunities to have more flexibility with your SVG icons as needed. So what I mean by that is this top square currently has just a 60% opacity on it. And that's what we're relying on to come up with this interaction between the top and bottom square. It'd be great to have a little more flexibility once this SVG is in place to update any of these colors as needed. And this would really come in handy for things like hover interactions as well. Additionally, you can see that we have things like transforms on these shapes, and it'd be good to flatten everything down to simple paths because in our situation, we just want this to be a static asset. We're not going to animate it. If we did need to retain separate elements of this icon for animation, like let's say on hover, the top square floated up a bit, we would want to retain these as separate shapes. But for this demonstration, it's just a simple branding logo, so we can flatten everything down and optimize it pretty far. So let's grab this first step and drag out a new instance. The first thing we can do is take our logo type, and I'm going to hit Control or Command E to vectorize it. So that turns this into a path. Next, let's turn our attention to the logo icon. And right now we have these two shapes with the opacity. My goal with this is to basically flatten this out so there's no overlap in the shapes, and also to apply solid fills to each of these three sections we see in the icon, so we have direct control over them in CSS. So this may take a little bit of creativity, but basically we're going to use the different Boolean shape tools that you see here in Figma. We can either union, subtract, intersect, or exclude, and we'll use a combination of these to end up with three shapes that will have solid fills as needed instead of using this opacity to achieve this overlap effect. So the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate the top layer, and I think I'm going to cut this using the subtract selection from the bottom. And what we should end up with if we turn off our top layer now is this bottom shape. So let's call this bottom, just so we're clear temporarily on what's going on. You can see that it's actually a live Boolean operation between these two shapes. We'll flatten that in just a moment. And it looks like we'll actually want to retain a separate instance of our square bottom. So let's pull that back out. That's a really nice thing about keeping these live operations, as well as duplicating each of the steps when you're optimizing these SVGs. So now let's focus on, if we duplicate both these layers, I think we'll need them one more time for the final operation. But now let's focus on getting this intersection between the two. So in our Boolean operations, we're going to use intersect selection, and this will act as our center. And lastly, we have our top and bottom. Let's turn off these newly created paths clarity real quick. I'm going to temporarily pull the bottom on top of the top and use subtract once more. And this will end up with our top layer. So if we turn on all of these, you'll see the colors aren't in place that we need just yet. So what we can do is basically sample the colors that we see with our transparency here on the left. So the top requires a fill of this color here, which looks like it already had. The center, if we grab this item here, will act as the center color. And now we basically have faked that overlap without using any transparencies. Everything is a solid fill. And you can see that our path has no overlap. Let's duplicate this step one more time and rename everything. Let's go back into our logo icon, and here we can actually flatten each of these three parts of our icon. Okay, and so now we have these two cleaned up paths that we want to use for separate elements of this logo. We're going to grab this logo icon and pull it out separately, and then do the same thing for our logo type. So let's pull these out to the right here. And just get everything aligned real quick. Okay, so we have our logo icon. Right now it's just grouped. Instead, I'm going to make this a frame. I'm going to hit Control or Command and the Alt or Option key plus G, and that'll convert this to be a frame. So we can say that this is our logo and it's the icon inside of the logo. Let's get rid of this unnecessary group that we don't need. Now we just have three simple shapes here. Let me rearrange my layers real quick and collapse this down. And on this logo icon, we can create an export of SVG. Now keep in mind that we don't want any extra padding around this element, so we're just exporting it directly. However, if you wanted nicer pixel values to work with, you could definitely replicate the steps we followed with the icon above. Next up, with our logo type, let's also put this in a frame. So again, Control or Command plus Alt or Option and G, and this will be our logo type. Same thing, we'll want to add an export of SVG. Let's get both of these exported to our desktop real quick. And now we'll switch back over to our optimization tool. So let's open this up. We're going to open an SVG. This would be our icon in this case. You can verify it by looking at the image tab. Here's the markup that we want. So we'll copy this in to our HTML file here. Let's clean up this code real quick. All right, so we can get rid of these fills that we don't want hard-coded. And be sure to add a viewbox with the same dimensions as our width and height attributes. So we have 0092 and 111 at the end there. Let's add a class of logo icon. And on each of these paths, we'll want a more specific class. So this bottom path is actually that top shape. So let's say this is the logo icon, and we'll say it's the icon top. Next up, we have our center here. And lastly, we have the logo icon, and it's the icon bottom variation. Cool, so let's get that saved. In our CSS, we can actually start targeting this. So let's make a section for our logo. So we have logo icon, and I think we can actually just start targeting those individual shapes. So we have logo icon top. This is going to need a fill, and it's going to be this color stone 66. I'm going to copy this down 2 times and get everything spaced as needed. Now we have our center, which has color alarm, and I believe this is color alarm 87 that we see here. And lastly, for our icon bottom, this will have color alarm and 67. So if we give this a save, and so you can see that it appears in our file here, I'm going to hide our chevron icon for now because we want to focus on our logo. So let's hide that. Okay, so this is looking great. All right, so next let's turn our attention to the logo type. So we'll open that SVG and grab the markup. You can see that this is quite a complex path because of all the typography glyphs. But if this would save us from loading up a whole dedicated typeface just for this logo, we might actually be saving quite a bit in terms of server request and file size. So we'll paste this markup into our file. It's a huge block because of this path, but let's get it cleaned up. Move this closing tag, get rid of this fill, and we'll make sure that we add a view box that matches the dimensions, so 356 and 74. And let's give this a class as well, and we'll call this logo, and we'll say that's the logo type. So let's give this a save. And now that we have this logo type in our code, let's target that class name in CSS. And we'll say that the fill of this is going to be our lightest color, which is color alarm 94. Give that a save. And if we look at our live preview, everything's appearing as expected. So let's handle the alignment of these two items next to each other and also make sure that we're good in terms of accessibility. So let's imagine that we're using this as a link to the homepage, as is common in a lot of global headers. So we'll open up an anchor tag. This will just go to our root URL here. Let's give this a class of logo, and we'll want to open this up. Let's make sure we drag our SVG icons inside of that anchor tag by moving it up. And next up, we want to make sure for accessibility that we have hidden text inside of that link that describes the link well. So we'll say we have a span of screen reader only, and this is using that class that was already provided just to visually hide the text but still make it accessible. So here our hidden text is going to say stacker, which is of course the wording that we see in our SVG. And lastly, let's add a role of presentation to each of these SVGs because they don't need to be accessible to the screen reader DOM. Next up, if we go into our CSS and target logo directly, let's just say this is display flex, and we're going to vertically align items center. Give that a save. It's getting closer. If we reference our target design here, we'll see that these two elements have a gap between them. This should actually be 32 pixels. So on our logo type, we can actually target that directly with a margin left of 32 pixels. Give that a save, and everything's looking good. So with these examples, you can see the power of working with SVG. If we clean up our design files ahead of time, get it exported, and optimize the code, we don't add a ton of extra markup to our files, but we have a ton of flexibility with the scaling and sizing of these icons and decorative elements. And by targeting specific paths with CSS, it unlocks a lot of opportunities for hover interactions, for updating things individually, and just makes things a lot more maintainable going forward. All right, so that actually does it for this how-to. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like to check out the code for this project, the link to the GitHub repo is in the description. And you'll also find a link to the public Figma file that we used to clean up our assets and get them exported. So thank you so much for watching this how-to. If there are other topics that you'd like to see covered in future tutorials, be sure to leave a comment with what you'd like to see.